surrender and return to the whip, or stay and die by the sword. That was the choice facing the Hebrews as the shadows grew long over the Red Sea. Some argued for a return to Egypt. At least there was bread in the dungeons. Others prepared to fight with nothing but rocks and bare hands. Both sides were looking at the horizontal plane of human logic. No one was looking at the water. No one expected that the third option involved walking where no man had ever walked. The air at Pi-hahiroth was thick, a suffocating mixture of salt spray and dry desert heat. The sun was a dying ember on the horizon, bleeding deep purples and bruised oranges across a sky that offered no answers. To the east, the Red Sea roared, a vast, churning expanse of sapphire and ink that hissed against the jagged limestone shore. It wasn't just a body of water, it was a liquid wall, cold and indifferent to the 2 million souls huddled along its edge. The smell of brine was sharp, stinging the nostrils of ex-slaves who had spent their lives smelling only the mud and straw of the brick pits. Moses stood on a weathered outcropping of rock, his boots caked in the dust of a journey that felt like it was ending before it truly began. He gripped his wooden staff, a gnarled piece of almond wood that felt heavy, not with its own weight, but with the collective terror of a nation. Behind him, the camp was a chaotic tapestry of human desperation. He could hear the frantic bleating of goats and the low, mournful lowing of cattle, sounds that were nearly drowned out by the rising tide of human voices. It was a sound he would never forget, the sound of 2 million people realizing they were trapped. "Why did you bring us here?" a man screamed, his voice cracking with the strain of a 3-day march. He was a stonecutter, his hands calloused and stained with the gray dust of Egyptian masonry. He stepped toward Moses, his eyes wild. "Were there not enough graves in Egypt? Did you have to bring us out here into the mouth of the wilderness just to watch our children get slaughtered?" The accusation hung in the air like a physical weight. Nearby, a young mother clutched her infant so tightly her knuckles turned white, her eyes darting between the dark sea and the shimmering desert floor. She could feel the vibration before she saw the cause. A low, rhythmic thrumming began to pulse through the soles of her feet. It wasn't the sea, it wasn't the wind. It was the heartbeat of an empire. On the northern horizon, a massive wall of dust began to rise, blotting out the remaining light of the sun. It looked like a localized sandstorm at first, but as it drew closer, the glint of bronze began to spark through the haze. The Israelites watched in frozen horror as the dust settled into the terrifying geometry of war. 600 elite chariots, the heavy cavalry of the 18th dynasty, emerged in a perfect, lethal line. These weren't just wagons. They were the tanks of the ancient world, machines of imported timber and leather, manned by archers whose arrows could find a throat from 100 yards while traveling at full gallop. The sound was deafening now, the thunder of thousands of hooves and the metallic rattle of chariot wheels hitting the stony ground. The Egyptians weren't just coming, they were hunting. Pharaoh had regretted his mercy, and now his iron fist was closing around the throat of his former slaves. The Israelites were pinned against the water's edge, caught in a geographic kill-box. To their left and right were the impassable crags of the Migdol Mountains. Behind them was a wall of bronze and chariots, and in front of them, the deep, dark abyss of the Red Sea. Moses looked up. The wind began to pick up, whipping his cloak around his legs. The first stars were beginning to pierce the violet sky, but they felt millions of miles away. The people were falling to their knees, some wailing, some praying, some cursing. The situation was mathematically impossible. There was no military strategy, no diplomatic route, and no physical escape. "Don't move," Moses whispered to himself, though his own heart hammered against his ribs like a drum. He turned to face the terrified multitude, his voice rising with a supernatural authority that seemed to cut through the roar of the wind and the screams of the crowd. "Do not be afraid. Stand firm and you will see the deliverance the Lord will bring you today. The Egyptians you see today, you will never see again." But as he spoke, he looked back at the waves. The water was still there. The chariots were still coming. The transition from slavery to freedom was about to be baptized in blood or water, and the world held its breath. To understand the terror at the Red Sea, one must first understand the world that forged these people. The year was approximately 1446 BC, a time when Egypt's new kingdom was the undisputed superpower of the known world. This wasn't just a kingdom. It was a military and cultural machine that had perfected the art of empire. The geography of the Exodus was a character in itself, A brutal, unforgiving landscape where the Nile Delta's lush greenery gave way to the Red Land, a scorched wilderness of limestone and sand that had swallowed entire armies before. Pi-Hahiroth, where the Israelites found themselves hemmed in, was likely a narrow coastal plain situated between the rugged heights of Migdol and the shifting waters of the sea. In this region, the climate was a relentless adversary. During the day, temperatures soared past 110 degrees, turning the sand into a furnace that radiated heat through the thin sandals of the travelers. At night, the desert underwent a violent transformation, dropping to a bone-chilling 50 degrees. There were no natural resources here, no wells, no shade, and no mercy. The Israelites were miles away from the nearest reliable water source, making their situation not just a military crisis, but a biological one. Socially, the world was governed by a rigid, divinely ordained hierarchy. In the Egyptian mind, the pharaoh wasn't just a leader. He was the Horus-born, a living god who maintained Ma'at, the cosmic balance. Below him were the priests and the military elite, and at the very bottom were the Apiru, the displaced laborers and slaves. For 430 years, the Israelites had been part of this lower caste. Their social identity was rooted in the rhythmic suffering of the brick pits and the construction of supply cities like Pithom and Ramesses. They weren't soldiers. They were a community of families, men, women, children, and the elderly. They carried with them the mixed multitude, non-Israelites who had seen the plagues, and decided that any god was better than the gods of Egypt. This social melting pot was fragile, held together only by a tenuous hope and the leadership of a man who had been an Egyptian prince and a Midianite shepherd. Politically, the stakes couldn't have been higher. Egypt was in its 18th dynasty, a period of aggressive expansion. The loss of 2 million state slaves wasn't just a blow to the labor force, it was a geopolitical catastrophe. If the Hebrews escaped, it would signal to every neighboring vassal state, from the Hittites to the Canaanites, that Egypt was weak. Pharaoh's decision to pursue was a desperate attempt to restore national honor after the humiliation of the 10 plagues. He didn't just send soldiers, he sent the Marianu, the elite chariot warrior class. These men were the aristocracy of the battlefield, trained from childhood in the school of the chariot. They operated machines of war that were masterpieces of engineering, lightweight, flexible timber frames, 6-spoked wheels for stability, and bronze-tipped spears that could pierce leather armor at 30 miles per hour. The religious reality of this moment was a direct confrontation between two clashing cosmologies. To the Egyptians, the Red Sea was under the domain of deities like Hapi, the god of water, or even the chaos serpent Apophis. The 10 plagues had already been a systematic execution of Egypt's pantheon. Turning the Nile to blood challenged Hapi. The darkness challenged Ra, the sun god. Now, at the water's edge, the final battle was taking place. The Israelites were struggling to shed centuries of polytheistic influence. They were learning that their God, Yahweh, didn't live in a stone temple or a golden idol. He was the invisible I Am, who moved in pillars of cloud and fire. In the ancient world, a god's power was measured by his ability to control nature. If the Red Sea didn't open, then in the eyes of the world, Pharaoh's gods were still the masters of the earth. Economically, the Exodus represented the largest transfer of wealth in antiquity. Exodus 12 records that the Israelites plundered the Egyptians, leaving with silver, gold, and fine clothing. This wasn't just compensation for centuries of unpaid labor. It was the seed money for a new nation. However, wealth is useless in a kill box. As the chariots approached, the value of that gold plummeted to zero. Each Egyptian chariot represented a massive state investment, thousands of pieces of silver in imported wood, bronze, and trained horses. Pharaoh was literally throwing the Egyptian treasury into the desert to reclaim his property. This was the world where the miracle was set, a superpower at its peak, a geography designed to kill, and a newly minted nation of ex-slaves who were about to find out that their God was bigger than the economy, the politics, and the very laws of physics that governed the ancient world. At the center of this storm stood a man who never wanted the job. At 80 years old, Moses was a walking contradiction. His skin was leathered by 40 years of Midianite sun, etched with the deep lines of a shepherd who had learned the language of the wilderness. He wore a simple, coarse wool tunic, a far cry from the linen and gold he'd worn in the courts of Pharaoh decades ago. His beard was a shock of white, yet his eyes, dark and piercing, retained a fire that age couldn't quench. Physically he was strong, but his hands, as they gripped his staff, had a slight tremor that wasn't from old age, but from the crushing weight of 2 million lives resting on his shoulders. Moses' relationship with the people was fraught with tension. To them he was both a liberator and a suspect. They'd followed him out of Egypt because the plagues were undeniable, but their loyalty was as shallow as a desert stream. He wasn't just their leader, he was their surrogate father, their judge, and their lightning rod for every frustration. When things went well, he was a hero. When the water ran out or the enemy appeared, he was a traitor. This relational burden was compounded by his own past. He was an Egyptian prince who had murdered a man, a Hebrew who had been rejected by his own people, and a fugitive who had tried to hide in the desert. He carried the imposter syndrome of a man who felt he was speaking with a stuttering tongue for a God who was too big for his mouth. Psychologically, Moses was in the middle of a private war. Hidden beneath his stoic exterior were the scars of trauma. He'd spent 40 years trying to forget Egypt, only to be sent back into its heart. He feared his own inadequacy. Every time the people grumbled, a voice in his head likely whispered that they were right, that he was just a shepherd playing at being a king. He wasn't a military strategist. He didn't have a plan for a sea crossing. He was a man who worked strictly on a need-to-know basis with the Almighty, and at this moment, he didn't know much. He felt the visceral fear of every parent in that camp, the dread of watching those he led get slaughtered because he made the wrong turn. Spiritually, however, Moses was undergoing a final, radical transformation. He had moved past the burning bush stage of arguing with God. His faith had been forged in the fire of the 10 plagues, but this, the Red Sea, was the ultimate refinement. He was learning that faith wasn't about having an exit strategy. It was about absolute surrender to the one who doesn't need one. He had to bridge the gap between his human fear and God's divine sovereignty. His journey was moving from, "Who am I that I should go?" to, "The Lord will fight for you." The Israelites, as a collective character, were a people of the middle. They were no longer slaves, but they weren't yet free men. They carried the slave mentality, a psychological condition where security, even in chains, feels safer than the terrifying uncertainty of freedom. Their defect was their short memory. They could witness the Nile turn to blood and then forget it the moment they saw a chariot wheel. They were human, fragile, and utterly relatable. They represented the part of us that wants the miracle but hates the process. Moses had to be the anchor for this drifting nation. He had to stand in the gap, humanly afraid but spiritually resolute. He was the bridge between the groans of the people and the silence of God. As the chariots grew closer, Moses stopped looking at the dust and started looking at the invisible. He was no longer the man who ran away from a dead Egyptian. He was the man who was about to stand his ground against an entire empire. The transformation was complete. The shepherd had become the deliverer, not by his own strength, but by becoming a vessel for a power that the sea itself had to obey. The conflict at the Red Sea was a four-front war, a perfect storm of impossibility that attacked the Israelites physically, socially, psychologically, and spiritually. It wasn't just a hurdle. It was a dead end designed to prove that without divine intervention, death was the only mathematical certainty. Physically, the threat was lethal and tangible. The Egyptian army was the most sophisticated killing machine of the Bronze Age. 600 chosen chariots, the elite guard, were backed by all the chariots of Egypt. We're talking about thousands of horses, the rhythmic thunder of wheels, and a wall of polished bronze that reflected the dying sun like a terrifying second sunrise. Each chariot held a driver and an archer equipped with composite bows that could outrange any makeshift weapon the Hebrews possessed. They were 3 miles away, then 2, then 1. The geography was a natural trap. The Israelites were boxed in by the Migdal mountain range, jagged, impassable cliffs that rose like fortress walls to their left and right. To their front was the Red Sea, a body of water at least 8 miles wide at its narrowest suspected crossing point, with depths that could swallow a skyscraper. There was no bridge, no fleet of boats, and no time to build either. Socially, the conflict was an internal explosion. 2 million people don't panic quietly. The camp was a cacophony of accusations. The mixed multitude and the various tribes were turning on each other, and ultimately, on Moses. The social fabric of this new nation was tearing at the seams. "It would have been better for us to serve the Egyptians than to die in the desert," they shouted. Exodus 14:12. This was a social insurrection. Moses wasn't just facing Pharaoh. He was facing a potential lynch mob of his own people. The pressure of collective despair is a heavy force. It creates a vacuum where leadership usually collapses. The people were mourning their own deaths before they had even occurred, creating a toxic atmosphere of defeatism that was more contagious than any plague. Psychologically, the battle was one of pure terror. Fear does something to the human brain. It narrows the vision until all you can see is the threat. The Israelites weren't seeing a path. They were seeing the graves of Egypt they had escaped. They were experiencing a massive collective trauma response. For 400 years, the sound of an Egyptian whip was the law. That deep-seated fear of their masters didn't vanish because they walked for 3 days. As those chariots approached, the slave inside each of them screamed for them to kneel, to beg, to go back to the mud pits. The conflict was the paralyzing weight of a past they couldn't outrun and a future that looked like a blood-soaked beach. Spiritually, this was the ultimate crisis of faith, the dark night of the soul for an entire nation. Where was the God of the plagues? Why had the pillar of cloud led them into a cul-de-sac? The silence of God in the moments before a catastrophe is the hardest test any believer faces. It felt like a divine betrayal. They had trusted the blood on the doorposts. They had trusted the midnight departure. But now, the promise of a land of milk and honey looked like a cruel bait and switch. The spiritual conflict was the doubt that God was actually good, or that he was actually there. It was the temptation to believe that they were alone in a cold, indifferent universe, about to be erased by a king who claimed to be a god. The escalation was relentless. First, the distant dust cloud. Then, the sound of the trumpets. Then, the sight of the vanguard. The Israelite leaders tried to organize a defense, but how do you defend 1 million children against professional killers? The panic reached its peak as the sun dipped below the horizon. Everything was lost. Every human avenue was closed. The mountains said, no. The sea said, no. The army said, death. In this moment of total darkness, the pillar of cloud did something unexpected. It moved. It didn't lead them forward into the water yet. It moved behind them, standing between the camp of Israel and the camp of the Egyptians. On one side, it was a wall of terrifying darkness to the Egyptians. On the other, it provided light to the Israelites. It was a stay of execution, a supernatural barrier that bought them a few hours of time. But the sea was still there. The conflict hadn't been resolved. It had only been paused. The multi-layered impossibility remained, waiting for a move that defied every law of the known world. The narrative clock slows to a crawl. The roar of the wind begins to drown out even the cries of the people. This is the moment where the horizontal meets the vertical. Moses stands at the edge of the lapping waves, the salt spray misting his face. Behind him, the glowing pillar of fire casts long, flickering shadows. He hears the voice, not in his ears, but in the very marrow of his bones. Why are you crying out to me? Tell the Israelites to move on. Move on? Into the abyss. Moses steps forward until the cold water of the Red Sea swirls around his ankles. He raises the staff, the same staff that had struck the Nile and brought the locusts. This time, he isn't just performing a sign, he is acting as the herald of a new creation. He stretches his hand out over the dark, churning expanse. Then the world breaks. A strong east wind, Exodus 14:21, begins to howl. This isn't a breeze, it's a gale of supernatural proportions, a localized hurricane that screams across the water. But instead of creating chaotic waves, the wind acts like a divine blade. The water begins to pile up. The Israelites watch, paralyzed, as the sea is literally shoved aside. The sound is like 1,000 freight trains, a deep guttural groaning of the earth. In the light of the pillar of fire, they see it. A corridor. A path of dry land, carved through the heart of the deep. The walls of water rise on the right and the left, towering hundreds of feet into the air. In the bioluminescent glow of the disturbed sea life, the people can see the shapes of fish and leviathans pressed against the translucent liquid walls. The ground beneath their feet isn't muddy or slick. It is dry land, prepared by the breath of God. Go, Moses commands. The march begins. 2 million people, carrying infants, leading livestock, dragging carts of Egyptian gold, descend into the seabed. The sensory immersion is overwhelming. The roar of the wind, the smell of ancient salt and exposed coral, the sight of the shimmering water walls held back by an invisible hand. They walk where no human has walked since the dawn of time. It takes the entire night. A logistical miracle of movement, a nation walking through the mouth of death to find life on the other side. As the first light of dawn begins to gray the eastern sky, the last of the Israelites reaches the far shore. But the crisis isn't over. The pillar of cloud lifts. The Egyptians, fueled by a mixture of rage and supernatural blindness, see the path. Pharaoh gives the order, "Charge!" 600 elite chariots, followed by the entire Egyptian host, thunder into the corridor. They see the dry ground. They see their prey. But as they reach the middle of the sea, the environment turns hostile. The ground that was dry for the Hebrews becomes a quagmire for the Egyptians. The wheels of the chariots begin to swerve and lock. The bronze pins snap as the axle trees grind against the rising mud. "Let us flee from the Israelites," the Egyptians scream. "The Lord is fighting for them." Exodus 14:25. Moses stands on the eastern bank. The sun is rising now, a golden disk breaking over the mountains of Arabia. God speaks one last time. "Stretch out your hand over the sea." Moses obeys. As his hand moves, the wind ceases. The invisible force holding back the millions of tons of water vanishes. For a heartbeat, there is a terrifying silence. Then, the collapse. The walls of water don't just fall, they implode. A roar that can be heard for miles echoes through the canyon as the Red Sea returns to its strength. The Egyptian army, the pride of the 18th dynasty, the invincible Marianu, the God King's elite, is erased in a single violent heartbeat. The chariots are smashed like toys. The horses and riders are swept away by the churning tide. When the spray finally settles and the water calms, the silence is deafening. The Israelites stand on the shore, looking back at the sea that was supposed to be their grave. They see the wreckage of the world's greatest army washing up on the sand. The transition is complete. They went down as slaves. They came up as a free nation. Moses looks at his hand. The staff is just wood again. But the man is finally at peace. He breaks into song, a roar of triumph that echoes across the desert. "I will sing to the Lord, for he is highly exalted. Both horse and driver he has hurled into the sea." Exodus 15:1. The immediate aftermath of the Red Sea crossing was a psychological shockwave that redefined the ancient world. On the eastern shore, the atmosphere shifted from terror to a transcendent, euphoric joy. For the first time in 4 centuries, the Israelites weren't looking over their shoulders for a master. The physical evidence was scattered along the shoreline: bronze armor, broken chariot wheels, and the remains of the very men who had personified their oppression. This was the birth of a nation. It wasn't signed with a treaty. It was sealed with a miracle. The communal impact was profound. The people feared the Lord and put their trust in him and in Moses, his servant. Exodus 14:31. The social insurrection vanished, replaced by a liturgical celebration. Miriam, Moses' sister, led the women in a dance of defiance and victory that would be remembered for millennia. Their identity was no longer slaves of Egypt, but the redeemed of Yahweh. This event became the foundational memory of Israel, the North Star they would look to during every future exile and trial. Regionally, the news of the Red Sea crossing spread like wildfire through the trade routes of the Sinai and Canaan. It was the ancient equivalent of a nuclear blast. The nations of the Levant, the Edomites, the Moabites, and the inhabitants of Canaan were melting with fear. Exodus 15:15. When the Israelite spies entered Jericho 40 years later, the reputation of this event was still so potent that it paralyzed the city's defenders. The Red Sea crossing proved that Israel's God didn't just exist. He was a warrior who could dismantle the laws of nature to protect his people. The biblical legacy is eternal. This event became the primary lens through which the rest of the Bible interprets salvation. The prophets used the Red Sea as a template for God's future deliverance. The psalmist sang of it as the ultimate display of God's power over chaos. In the New Testament, the Apostle Paul identifies the crossing as a type of baptism, a passage through water from the old life of slavery to the new life of the Spirit. 1 Corinthians 10:1-2. Ultimately, the Red Sea points to a greater exodus. It foreshadows the moment when Jesus Christ would face a different kind of impossible sea, the abyss of death and sin. Just as Moses raised his staff to open a path through the water, Christ raised his cross to open a path through the grave. The Red Sea is the Old Testament resurrection, a definitive statement that God's specialty is making a way where there is no way. It ensured that the lineage of Abraham would survive to bring forth the Messiah, ensuring that the promise made in a garden long ago would eventually reach the whole world. The story of the Red Sea isn't just a dusty record of an ancient miracle. It is a mirror reflecting the impossibilities you face today. Just like the Israelites, you may find yourself hemmed in. Perhaps you are caught between a Pharaoh of a mounting debt and a Red Sea of a lost job. Maybe you're trapped between the mountains of a failing relationship and the approaching chariots of a health crisis. The geography of your life might look like a kill box where every exit is barred and every hope is sinking. Ask yourself, what is the Red Sea in your life right now? What is the thing that makes you want to say, I'd rather go back to the chains than face this? The principle of the Red Sea is this: God often leads us into dead ends so that we can finally stop trusting in our own strategies and start trusting in His sovereignty. The same God who commanded the east wind is the God who hears your whispers today. He hasn't changed. He isn't a God of Plan B. He is the God who specializes in the third option, the one you haven't even thought of yet. Your impossible is God's platform. When you are at the edge of the water and the dust of the enemy is rising, the command remains the same. Do not be afraid. Stand firm, and you will see the deliverance the Lord will bring you today. Exodus 14:13. Faith isn't the absence of the army. It's the presence of the pillar. Steps for today. 1. Surrender the staff. Stop trying to solve the math of your problem. Acknowledge that you are at a dead end and give it to the one who owns the sea. 2. Move forward. Faith doesn't wait for the water to part before it starts walking. Take the next small, obedient step, even if the ground still looks wet. A prayer for you. Lord, I am standing at my own Red Sea. I am afraid, and the enemy is loud. I confess that I've been looking at the chariots instead of your fire. Right now, I choose to stand still. I choose to trust that you are my deliverer. Open a path where I see only waves. Lead me through the deep and onto the shore of your peace. In the name of Jesus, amen. If this story spoke to your situation, I want to hear from you. Comment below with the word Exodus as a declaration that you are trusting God to open your path today. Don't forget to subscribe for more journeys into the heart of the Word. Remember, the sea didn't stop God then, and your mountain won't stop Him now.